Let's get things going. So first of all, good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming back to the next installment of JavaScript Live, which is part of the wider live series that we host here at Amicus. My name is Jamie Crowley, and I recruit across the JavaScript and TypeScript market for London-based businesses. That also includes hiring remotely across Europe in the modern world. So today we've got a brilliant talk coming up from Ruben Casas, who is a staff engineer over at Postman. He's going to give us a talk all based around micro-frontends and what exactly they are. The presentation today is going to be a relatively short one initially. Ruben's produced a really cool slideshow that we're going to run through. And then if people want to ask questions throughout, please do ask anything you like, and we'll make sure that Ruben answers your questions. We'll probably do that at the end of the presentation. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section or in the chat box, and I'll make sure we get around to them at the end of the conversation as well. But it is designed to be as interactive as possible. So anything at all you want to ask, please ask away. But we'll leave it there, really. I'll hand over to Ruben, who's obviously our specialist for today, and let him crack on with this presentation.
All right, thanks, Jamie. Hello, everybody. So let me just start by sharing my screen. Okay, not that one, of course. That one. Okay, so yeah, as Jamie said, my name is Ruben Casas. I am a staff engineer at Postman. And before Postman, I worked at American Express for 3 years. And I was working there creating a micro-frontend framework that was used by about 2,000 developers, big teams, and working on a single code base. That was a huge company. And I had a lot of experience with micro-frontends. I've been trying to get this topic going, and people, explaining what micro-frontends are and how can they be beneficial for you. And that's what I'm going to do today. So if this is your first time hearing about micro-frontends, good news is you will get a really good introduction from this presentation. If you have heard about micro-frontends before, have you been to a micro-frontends presentation before? Well, I hope that this clarifies a lot of the misconceptions and things that might not be right. There are a lot of misconceptions and myths about micro-frontends. So both ways. So if it's first time or if you heard about them before, then I hope it's going to be useful. And traditionally, every single micro-frontend presentation starts with the following question. The presenter will be like, okay, but first, before we go into my presentation, let's find the definition of micro-frontends. So what are micro-frontends? And the answer is usually this nice definition from Cam Jackson, who wrote an article over on ThoughtWorks. What's it called? Forgot the name of the article, but I think it's just micro-frontends. And it's basically, this definition is an architectural style where independently deliverable front-end applications are composed into a greater whole. This is a brilliant definition. However, if you read this definition again, let me ask you, do you know what micro-frontends are after the definition? It's great. It's a great definition. Don't take it wrong. But what are micro-frontends really, like in practice? Can we take that definition and go beyond and explain what they are? So the answer to what really micro-frontends really are is, well, it depends. And I'm going to avoid it depends a lot, because I say it depends as a staff engineer and architect. I use that word a lot, so I hopefully not going to use it a lot during this presentation. But it depends, and let's see why it depends. So first of all, the naming of micro-frontends is unfortunate, and there are a lot of misconceptions and myths around them. And one of the big problems is the name. Like when you see these micro-frontends, we can't even agree on how to spell it. I mean, does it have a dash in the middle? Does it have a space? I don't know. I've gone with the one in the middle, which is the dash, micro dash frontends. But we can't even agree on the name. So the naming is unfortunate. And actually, the name first appeared as micro-frontends back in 2016 with the ThoughtWorks technology radar, where the first time that they put that micro-frontends word together was on this issue, the technology radar. But actually, micro-frontends are not that new. I mean, they were like known as micro UI before that, and people were implementing this architectural style before the name was attributed to micro-frontends by ThoughtWorks. And actually the name is like a play on the microservices architecture, trying to make that name on similar to microservices, because micro-frontends are basically the same concepts of microservices, but for the front end. So they thought, let's call them micro-frontends because, people are familiar with microservices. So let's call them micro-frontends. However, that I think caused more problems because, when you see micro-frontends, you start thinking, okay, are they small applications? And also, when you think about microservices have this concept of being technology agnostic, where they promise that you can just basically choose your own technology, your own language, and you can write anything you like in your own language and then just deploy that as a microservice. So people immediately assume that micro-frontends have that same analogy with a technology agnostic analogy to microservices. Also, I've seen people like making this abbreviation of MFE to abbreviate micro-frontends, which also causes even more confusion with the name, because MFE could also be similar to a tool called Module Federation, which we probably will talk about in a minute. So when I see MFE, micro-frontends, the word, the definition, I think is a bit complex. So there are a lot of problems with the name and misconceptions about what they are. And also the parallel to microservices is a good parallel, but there are certain differences. So those are the differences that I'm going to be explaining in this presentation. And I'm going to be showing you what they are not. So more than explaining that definition at the beginning, which is a great definition, I'm just going to clarify what micro-frontends are not, instead of just clarifying the definition of what they are. So first of all, they are not a technology. And I mentioned briefly Module Federation earlier. And Module Federation, if you are not familiar, is a Webpack plugin that allows you to compose front-end applications at runtime. So you basically can just lazy load applications at runtime. And it's a technology, it's an architectural, it's not an architectural pattern. So this is very important with micro-frontends. They are not a technology. It's not something that you can npm install and you will get micro-frontends. Micro-frontends are an architectural pattern. And that architectural pattern is meant to solve an organizational problem. And if you get anything from this presentation, this is the key. It's an architectural pattern and it solves an organizational problem. And organizational problems like, for example, business agility, like you want to deploy faster, and independent deployments. And why is that? And the reason for this is because, when we split the monolith into microservices, all the backend developers are happy deploying their own applications independently, but then the front end was just here, still remained as a monolith, where you had to deploy everything as a single monolith. And you start having problems when you have a big company, a lot of developers, a lot of teams, where your business agility starts being impacted because you need a lot of coordination, you have a release train. So independent deployments could potentially help you solve that business agility by allowing your front-end developers to do the same thing that your back-end developers are doing, which is deploying independent parts of the application. So again, they are not a technology. Module Federation does not equal micro-frontends. Micro-frontends is an architectural pattern. And you could use Module Federation to achieve that goal and that architectural pattern. Cool. So they are not a technology. Now, this is another problem with the microservices analogy, and is that, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, when people think about microservices, they think, technology agnostic. And they think, okay, micro-frontends, if they are similar to microservices, it means that I can come and choose my own JavaScript framework. So this is the biggest misconceptions about micro-frontends. People, every single time I talk to someone about them, they say, well, but I think, mixing React and Vue and Angular and Svelte on the same page, I think that's not a good idea. And I'm like, yes, 100% agree. That is not a good idea. You shouldn't be mixing frameworks on the same page because it's a terrible idea. And we will see why it's a terrible idea. You probably know, I mean, mainly performance, but micro-frontends are not about multiple frameworks. You can use multiple frameworks. There are options where you potentially could have multiple frameworks, but I do not recommend it, and it's a terrible idea. And why is it a terrible idea? Well, unlike microservices, the front end is sharing one platform, which is the browser. So we don't have containers that are fully isolated, and all the front end units will have to be composed and then rendered by the browser. So one reason why having multiple frameworks is a bad idea is because once you get to the browser and you have a lot of JavaScript loaded by multiple frameworks, you will have performance issues, especially around bundle size. Like if you have React and Vue and Angular, they are all bringing their own tooling and their own bundles, which could affect performance. There are some tools out there, or there are some libraries nowadays that are trying to help you get around the bundle size issue on performance. But apart from the performance problem, there is also the problem with your organization. Like if you have 5 teams and 2 of them are working on React and 3 of them are working on Vue, then when you need to work on different features or share components or share component libraries, you will have like 2 different set of people with different special skills for that particular framework, which will be difficult for sharing knowledge and making sure that you are very good at that framework. So I don't really recommend that for the performance problems, but also because of not having that domain expertise in-house and having too many people working on 2 different things is probably not a good idea. Now, there are 2 exceptions where there might be a case where a micro-frontends loading multiple frameworks on the page is a good idea, or it might help you. And those 2 exceptions, again, exceptions, not the rule, is for example, the first one is the strangler pattern, where you have an old application. Let's say that we have an AngularJS application, and you want to incrementally update and replace it with React, for example. At that point, micro-frontends might be a good idea to have the 2 frameworks in parallel working at the same time, because it means that you don't have to do a full rewrite. You just basically take one of the old framework and then you just incrementally replace it with a new one. And actually, recently I learned the strangler pattern is actually called the strangler fig pattern. And it helps me visualize because it's named after a fig tree that basically consumes the parent tree until it just kills the old tree. So it basically starts growing from the top up of the parent tree until it completely consumes the old tree, and the old tree dies, and then the new tree remains. So the key here is once you finish the migration, you shouldn't keep both of the frameworks on the page. I mean, you can get rid of the old one and just stick to one. Don't use multiple frameworks. The second exception is mergers and acquisitions. So this is another exception where, for example, there is a company that is a large company, they have their own tooling and technology. And then there is a new team that has a new company has been acquired, and they bring their own tooling and their own tech stack. And then now, how do we, without rewriting the entire application for the company that has been acquired, how do we have, they were using Vue, how do we integrate it with React? In this case, that would be an exception where micro-frontends might be helpful for multiple frameworks. But again, don't recommend it. If anybody says, oh, micro-frontends are about multiple frameworks, now they're actually not about multiple frameworks. It's there, but it's not what they are about. So another one that is very common is, are they components? So this is more to do with the context of single page applications and React and new libraries where you have the component model, where you can just encapsulate some pieces of the UI into components that can be reused. And it's a great model. However, micro-frontends, again, going back to the micro word, they are not that small. I mean, components are usually things like buttons and smaller pieces of UI that you can reuse. But they usually don't have application logic. The application logic is the collection of those components working together in order to produce value for the users. So micro-frontends are not components. They can be a collection of components, but they are modeled around a business domain. And what I mean by a business domain is if I have a team who are specialized in, for example, the checkout page of a e-commerce website. That is the domain for the business domain for that particular company. Then you could create a micro frontend around that business domain, which is the checkout. But the button inside the checkout is not business domain, it's just a component. So the problem with components and creating such a small pieces of UI that can be developed independently is that you could encounter a lot of problems in terms of complexity. You will have hundreds of components that are decoupled around, floating around, and that causes something that I call the distributed components, which I believe is an anti-pattern. I mean, there are some people who disagree with me and say, you could have individual components down to the button level where you can distribute them and independently deploy them. However, it causes a lot of complexity. It causes a lot of things to manage. Like if you have every single button is deployed independently, it means that when you make that change to that button, you have to deploy the button, which completely removes all the benefits of micro frontends. Just remember, we are trying to improve business agility. We are trying to scale teams. And if we start introducing a lot of complexity, then it means that we will have a lot of problems that we had at the beginning, and we are not solving any problems with micro frontends. And also having multiple components, it means that unless you have a component library, which I do recommend, you will end up with a website that looks completely disjointed UI and not very consistent and coherent. So I think slicing micro frontends too small, like to the component level, is not a good idea. The best way of slicing micro frontends is give them to a particular team or a business domain where they can own the components or the micro frontends and they can deploy independently. Okay, so I have been explaining what they are not. So I have been just telling a little bit on the different misconceptions of micro frontends. So what are micro frontends like really? The answer is, oh, sorry, I said I wasn't going to say depends again, but well, it depends. It depends on your company. But the bottom line is they are an architectural pattern. So they are a way to solve a problem. And it's a type of architecture where you can split your front-end application into smaller, independently deployable units or UI, that modules, you can call them, that can be deployed by, developed by a team that owns them and maintains them, and they are independent, so they can move faster because they don't depend on other teams. So a lot of companies are trying to implement micro frontends, and another problem with micro frontends is there are so many implementations. Like many companies have their own version of micro frontends, they have their own tools. There are a lot of micro frontend frameworks, and it's fine. And this is to do with the nature of the problem that micro frontends are trying to solve, and is improve business agility and problems with the organization. The thing with that is every organization is different. Every organization has their own problems with scaling. They have their own problems with managing teams and communication and scaling teams, managing independent deployments, release trains. So because of that, there are many different variations or what micro frontends implementations look like. However, it doesn't mean that that is a problem, because this is a very specific solution for a specific problem. So if you're thinking about micro frontends, and there are a lot of companies today, you will be surprised how many companies are either thinking about implementing micro frontends, or in the case for American Express that I work for, they have successfully implemented micro frontends for a long time. So you'll be surprised how many companies are thinking about this. And just don't be discouraged by the multiple misconceptions out there. It's a problem that can be solved. But also, to clarify, you might not even need micro frontends at the end. So you could try many different things first to solve your organizational problem. It could be that you just need to have a better code organization. It might be that you might just have a monorepo, and that monorepo might be enough for your organization. It might be that the monorepo with certain build time composition, so you have a bunch of NPM packages that can be combined around build time, that might be enough to solve your issues. And then at the end of the scale, we have, okay, if nothing has helped your organizational issues, then you could consider micro frontends. Okay, what if we introduce independent deployments, and is that fact of having independent deployability going to help us move faster and solve these problems with communication between teams and problems with cross concerns and domains? If that's the case, then you could consider micro-frontends. And yeah, so that's the conclusion. You might not need them. They are an architectural pattern, and they could solve a lot of problems for large organizations looking to scale their teams. And very similar to microservices, but as I explained, there are some differences that you need to bear in mind. So I kept the presentation short intentionally because I know there are a lot of questions. So again, this topic and micro-frontends vary a lot, and it depends on a lot of the context and on the companies implementing them. So I left a lot of time at the end so we could go through those questions, because those particular use cases are very important to answer, and people might have a lot of questions. So Jamie, over to you, and let's take some questions.
Amazing, thank you very much. Yeah, so I think people have been holding off to be polite during, but now feel free to unload your questions in the Q&A section or the chat section. And as I mentioned, myself and Ruben will make sure we get to them. But Ruben, I had one question for you. Something that comes up a lot when I talk about micro-frontends with candidates is, do you feel like it tends to work better for bigger teams with a lot more people and there's lots of different people coming in from different angles, or is there actually any benefits at all for smaller teams, would you say?
Yeah, so this question is interesting. So and also to do with startups. I get this question with startups a lot. So are micro-frontends good for startups or smaller teams or even single developers? Let's start with single developers. Single developers, no. You don't need micro-frontends if you're a single developer, because I mean, this is a problem with multiple developers, multiple teams, large applications that require a lot of input from many people. So if you're a single developer, you can get familiar with the concepts in case you work for a large company and you want to implement those concepts at a large company. But if you're only working on a small project where you are the only developer or two developers, I don't think it's a good idea. I think it will just introduce a lot of unnecessary complexity. Yeah, just stick to a normal traditional monolithic application, then that should be fine. Now let's go to startups. With startups is a very interesting one, because I would say no. It's the same with microservices. So should startups use microservices and micro-frontends from the beginning? I would say no, but also depends on the startup. I said it depends. It also depends on the startup, because I know, for example, there was a big startup last year who's not doing very well these days, but they hired like 800 developers like within a year. So if you think about 800 developers working on a single front-end code base, then you will encounter a lot of problems, especially startups move really quickly. So they need to ship really, really quickly. At that point, might be a good idea, or at least think about the foundations from the beginning on how to modularize the code and how to potentially enable independent deployments later. But usually it's probably not a good idea for startups. So the answer is for large companies. So if you have multiple teams, multiple developers, a large code base, and bottom line, if you have a problem, yes, you should use micro-frontend. If you don't have a problem, then you don't need to introduce unnecessary complexity. You don't need them.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So we've had a couple of questions come through from people watching. So firstly from Chris, you mentioned federated modules earlier. Could you please expand on the pros and cons of that approach compared with iframe MFEs or NPM module MFEs?
Okay, so NPM module. So let's just clarify what type of composition. So composition means, you have two different things on the front end parts of the application, and you need to render them on the browser and compose them on the browser. So now, build time composition means that before the code gets deployed, you mix all of those pieces and then you deploy one single unit. Now, with runtime composition is where you have more than one unit, but they can be composed at runtime. So an example is I have a header and a footer, and that header gets updated at runtime, so I don't have to deploy the entire application to inject that header. Now, module federation is really good for that because you can basically load JavaScript like a dynamic import from another part that is deployed even on a separate CDN, doesn't have to be on the same CDN, and that can be loaded at runtime. Iframes could also kind of work that way, but the problem with iframes is they're a bit more like static and strict in terms of the layout. So you might have some shifting in layouts, and it could be done with iframes. I mean, a lot of micro-frontends implementations are just iframes. I remember, I think Spotify for a long time, they just had their micro-frontends encapsulated in just iframes. And you just deploy a new version of the iframe, the URL points to the iframe, and it works. But with module federation, the thing is, you can use them at runtime, which means that you can slice the application to a very granular. Going back to the header and the footer example, the header and the footer can be reused similar to a component that can be deployed independently, and you get that updated component at runtime, so you don't have to deploy the entire application. I hope that answers the question. If not, just shoot a follow-up question as well.
Amazing, thank you very much. The next question to come through is from Usama, who says, is there a way to roll it out gradually?
Gradual rollout, well, of micro-frontends as an architectural pattern or individual? Let's assume that is as an architectural pattern. Like if you want to roll out micro-frontends, yes. I mean, actually, that is the way I would do it. I wouldn't do a complete rewrite with micro-frontends because that's a lot of work. And the whole point of them is that you can modularize parts of your application, which means that you don't have to rewrite the entire thing. And I think I gave the example earlier with Angular and React. You know, like a lot of us for the past 5 years, our job has been to rewrite AngularJS into React. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people have done that. So one approach that people took was, okay, the AngularJS app is no good. We need to replace it. And they just started a completely 100% brand new React application. And once the React application was finished, they flipped the domain or they switched the traffic and then going from the old one onto the new one. Good luck trying to convince the business and everybody that that is a good idea, because it means that you are investing a lot of time and effort on this massive rewrite that can only be, you know, all the benefits will be at the end. So another approach, which micro-frontends are perfect for, is the gradual rollout or the gradual incremental replacement of old technology with new one, which is with the strangler pattern. So you could do that. I recommend it. So you don't have to do a big bang rewrite upfront.
Perfect. Kevin has asked, can you talk about how the micro-frontends can communicate with each other as they need to share some kind of data? For example, if login and security implementations are two micro-frontend implementations.
Okay, so communication and state. Let's start with state, because sharing state is one of those that questions I get a lot. And the answer is you should try to avoid sharing state. Basically, don't share global state or state between micro-frontends. The reason for this is as soon as you start sharing state, you start coupling the micro-frontends, and then you have another problem, which is basically you want it to go faster, but now you have a lot of dependencies between them, which requires coordination. And again, the point is to remove coordination. So you don't want to coordinate between different teams to achieve the goal. You want them to be as independent as possible. Now, obviously, that's not possible in certain cases. Like, for example, you mentioned in the question, you mentioned about the security login authentication. For authentication, I mean, there are methods like sharing the tokens in a secure cookie that can be shared across the browser session. So there is no like business logic living in the micro-frontends for authentication. Or there are some patterns like PubSub, like you can publish events and listen for those events. But the key here is that the micro-frontends should render independently, and they shouldn't break, and they shouldn't depend on any other micro-frontends. They should have always like that independent boundary. Like You shouldn't be depending on other domains. So there are many methods. Pops up, like subscription to browser events is one, sharing the cookie for authentication. And there are certain libraries in the, for example, the case of React, where you potentially could have independent micro-frontends that share some of communication or messages between them. But again, they are not coupled. If you start coupling micro-frontends, that is a recipe for disaster. That is the worst of both worlds, where you have a distributed monolith where everything is separated but still very tightly coupled together.
Perfect. The next question's come through is from Cuba, who says, which micro front-end framework would you recommend?
I don't recommend a micro-frontend framework. So this is another one that I get a lot, and people ask me a micro-frontend framework. Listen, you can use a micro-frontend framework, obviously. I don't recommend one because going back to this is a very specific problem, and it's a very specific to the company and to the business needs and to the organization. So the problem when you choose a micro-frontend framework is you're saying, oh, whatever it worked for company A and all the problems that they had, I'm going to apply those solutions to my problems, which might look very different. It might work. I mean, I used to work on a micro-frontend framework. So that micro-frontend framework was created for Amex, and they used it for their own use case. But I found that trying to make it work for other companies might be quite tricky, because there are a lot of trade-offs that were made. There were a lot of things that were not that were very specific for the Amex use case. So I do not recommend the micro-frontend framework. There are some around that are good, that they give you like the starting point, but then you need to make that decision, a conscious decision, that you're making a big trade-off of having something quick versus something that might not work for your use case. So you need to be really careful there. Some micro-frontend frameworks are there, just to mention, if you want to look at them. Single Spa is one that is very popular, probably most popular. Module Federation is not really a framework. Module Federation is a tool. So you can use it for this purpose, but it's very, very flexible. So you can do many things with Module Federation. So it's not actually a framework. A framework will include the router, will include the router, it will include some sort of state management or sharing state. It will include a lot of features for you out of the box. But again, you need to be really careful when you choose those.
Perfect. We've had an anonymous question come through. So how do you implement micro frontends for a legacy app? Would you rewrite the whole thing or only add new features in a micro frontend architecture way?
Okay, so I think I pretty much answered that before. I mean, recommended is you start gradually incrementing, like including new framework. There are two ways you could do that. You could either write the new architecture for the micro frontends and start moving things into them, like start like lifting and shifting, or you could keep the old architecture and start injecting micro frontends into that old architecture until you replace all of them, and then the old architecture is gone at the end. So it's like the strangler pattern and the reverse strangler pattern, where you can have one way or the other. Depends a lot on your architecture, but usually it's one or the other. You either create the new house and move everything into the new house, or you replace all the furniture in your old house and finally replace the walls and the foundation or whatever.
Okay. We've had a question come through from Wasiu as well, who says, how would a solo developer practice micro frontends? Do they have to be part of a team to truly have a feel of it?
Yeah, so yeah, that was part of the first question. If you're a solo developer, unless you want to learn, like for example, if you want to work for a big company and you know that company use micro frontends, then it will be a good idea for you to get familiar with the tools and the techniques and how they work. But for you as a small team working on your own side projects, no, don't need to.
Perfect. From John Morrison, he says, how do you manage version dependencies? Let's say you have two micro frontends with different versions of React. Are the micro frontends somewhat decoupled?
Yeah, so sharing dependencies is a tricky one. So that is a problem with micro frontends. But tools like module federation help a lot with dependencies and sharing dependencies. So if we decouple them, they technically will have two React applications, and you know that you can't have more than one React on the page, application on the page, or React instance on the page. So module federation helps you choose one of those versions and then reuse across all of the micro front ends. And it's fairly automatic. Like you just have to declare, this is the React version that we are using, and then at runtime, Webpack and module federation will find that version, and if it's available, it will provide it automatically for the micro front ends. There are cases like no React, but there are other libraries. Let's say you have a library. I can't think of any library. Let's say Lodash. Nobody uses Lodash anymore, but let's say Lodash has a version 4 and another team uses version 5. Then module federation will try to kind of use version 4, but if version 4 is not compatible, then it will fall back to version 5, and version 5 will be used. So at that point, you have two versions of the same library, which is not ideal, but at least your application doesn't break.
Brilliant. Question from Chris. He said, is it possible to support server-side rendering with a micro front-end architecture? And if so, which approach would you say is the most suitable?
Okay, server-side rendering in the context of single-page applications. Let's take it from the angle. Like, for example, React and server-side rendering. The answer is yes, you can. Actually, the framework, micro front-end framework I used to work at Amex was server-side render first for React. It's just a bit harder because you will need to like somehow collect all the micro frontends that you want to render on the page at a given time. You can do that on the URL and then server-side render them, which is possible. I know, for example, with Next.js, which is another very popular library for server-side rendering React, you can, very tricky. Even the author of module federation had some difficulties, but managed to make it work. And it works. It's possible. It's just a bit more difficult than a normal single-page application, but it can be done. And even if you go to traditional multi-page applications, that is probably the most basic way of splitting micro front ends. Is you have a URL path, and then you server-side render that path. The problem is there are some trade-offs like navigation and sharing components horizontally, but yeah, it's definitely possible.
Perfect. Question come through from Kyle. How do you decide which parts of your application should be separated into micro front ends, and do you try to figure out which parts can exist independently?
Okay, so how do you slice your application, or how do you separate the micro front ends out? This is a difficult one, but if you follow domain-driven design, and if you split your micro front ends around business domains, then you'll be in a better place than just guessing. So business domains go again is if your team, there is a team working on a particular part of the UI, and it's very clear. I mean, you will know like you have some teams that are in charge of the checkout, as I mentioned earlier, or some teams are responsible for the homepage or for the product pages in an e-commerce application, or the dashboard. At that point, you can split those out. One important thing with splitting is that you shouldn't split them too granularly. So if one team is in charge of 5 micro front ends, and that team has to deploy the 5 micro front ends in order to get a cohesive UI, then that is an anti-pattern. Because now you are like having a distributed monolith where you need to deploy multiple things in order to get something working. That's not the point. The point is that one thing that you need to deploy and is around the business domain, you can deploy independently without any input or without having to deploy multiple smaller pieces, because that just becomes a lot of overhead. So around business domain, so look at your application, look at your organization, what the teams look like, what they're responsible for, and then there is a good place to start the slicing. Now you can also slice per route, the URL, or horizontally as well. So if you look at your top URLs, and a common technique is you split them at that point if it's a business domain. So the top URL, that could be a micro front end. But also internally, like the header, it could be a micro front end if the header is complex enough for a team to own it and have to deploy it independently. If not, the header can remain a component. That is no point putting as a micro front end.
Brilliant,
Cool.
thanks, Ruben. So the final question we've got for now is from Saeed, who says, can you explain one more time if it's really an iframe that we need to integrate the micro front ends together, or what is the best approach?
Okay, so iframes are the most basic micro front end implementation that you can have. So an iframe is basically if you can split the URL and then you can have different iframes. That is the most basic one. Obviously, there are some problems with that approach and there are some trade-offs. It's the good one to get you started, but you will soon encounter problems like performance with iframes are not very good. Communication between iframes is also difficult. Also, you have composition, like horizontal composition is difficult. The layout might be shifting, like for example, iframes is very tricky to get the right height of them, so the layout might look a bit odd. But it's a good start. And as I said, I think it was Spotify. They had iframes for a long time. They made it work. I don't think there isn't anymore. But if you look at the Micro-Frontends article where the definition came from, there is an example with iframes. So it's a very rudimentary solution, but it can work.
Perfect. So that's the end of the questions we've got for now. Obviously, if anyone else has got another question, feel free to drop it in the next 30 seconds or so. While we're just kind of waiting for anyone to get any last questions, just wanted to say thanks a lot to Ruben for giving us the brilliant presentation today in front of all the questions so eloquently as well, and taking the time to do it for us. So what I will say at this point in time as well is that if anyone has known a friend that's not been able to make it today, or knows anyone that would be interested in taking part in this or watching it in the future, it will be posted on our YouTube channel over the next day or two, and I'll make sure to do a post on LinkedIn and send a message around when that is the case, so you can watch it there or pass it on to anyone who's interested. If there is anyone who's watching as well that would like to do what Ruben's done today and done a really good presentation on a topic that he's very passionate about and has a lot of expertise in, feel free to get in touch with me over LinkedIn or drop me an email. I'd love to have you on board if it's something that you're keen to get involved in. We've not had any other questions come through for now, so I think, to be fair, we had a lot to get through, so yeah. I think people are probably all questioned out. So yeah, we'll leave it there. But thanks a lot, Ruben, again for your time. Really appreciate it, and we'll speak again soon.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.